Welcome to the Hinckley Institute of Politics. My name is Sarah Stevens, and I will be the host for today's forum. The Hinckley Institute was established in 1965 through the generous bequest of the Noble Foundation and Robert H. Hinckley. The Institute is dedicated to teaching students respect for practical politics and the principle of citizen involvement in the government. The Hinckley Institute offers paid internships to students of all majors, locally in Washington, D.C., and in 35 countries around the globe. The Hinckley Institute offers the nation's only campaign management minor, week-long experiences to Washington, D.C., classes, and over $70,000 in academic scholarships. We invite students to go next door or to visit our website, www.hinckley.utah.edu, for more information. The title of today's forum is Lobbying at the Utah State Legislature. Today's guests are Lincoln Shurtz, the Director of Legislative Affairs at the Utah League of Cities and Towns and the in-house lobbyist for the group, and David Spatafore, President of the Spatafore Consulting Group and owner of Capstone Strategies, a Utah public affairs, governmental relations, and lobbying firm. Please join me in welcoming our guests. We will begin by hearing from David Spatafore.
Thank you, Sarah. You know, I told Lincoln this morning that he was going to start off, and obviously he took me seriously and is running a few minutes late, but we'll get started. It's an honor to be here. And as a matter of fact, 40 years ago, I was sitting roughly where you are today, because that's when I started my University of Utah career, was in the fall of 1973. So that just tells you how old I am, and which every year passes, and there are more creaks in your knees and hips and joints. But I think it was either 73 or 74, Tim, when Dr. Chambliss was my TA in history.
It was.
And so
it was actually spring of 75.
Spring of 75. So he has an eidetic memory, and he was the TA in my U.S. history class, and got to know Tim also many years ago, and we've been friends ever since. And it's always a pleasure to come back and speak to his class and to speak here. Let me just get started a little bit about me, and then we'll talk about lobbying, and then hopefully by that time Lincoln will come and he can give his opening remarks. But what I'd like to do for the majority of the 50 minutes is respond to your questions, because that's what's more important to me, is to hear what you're thinking and make sure that we respond to what's on your mind, rather than hear an old guy sitting in front of the class telling you about pontificating about so many stories. But as I mentioned, I started 40 years ago sitting where you are sitting today. And I got involved in government and politics actually that spring when I was, I think, elected to the University of Utah Student Assembly. In 74 and 75, I was in ASUU. I was the Public Affairs Board Chairman. And so I began my lobbying career essentially representing the University of Utah students on tuition issues. And I'll tell you this right now, I must have been so darn successful, because tuition 40 years ago was significantly less than what it is today. And so I'll take that as achievement one. But achievement two for me, which was, I think, probably really started me off on doing what I'm doing, was in the 1975 legislature, which was really the first year that I really started to focus on working at being a lobbyist. So this coming session will be my 40th session with a colleague from Utah State, and I say that proudly today because we kicked their butt on Thursday. I don't care if it was 4 points. It's a number in the left column and not the right column, and that's all that counts. But anyway, we began with the Utah Intercollegiate Assembly working to put a student on the Utah State Board of Regents. We believed it was very, very important to have that student voice on the State Board of Regents. And two wild-eyed kids from universities, from rural Utah, essentially, decided that we thought we could do that. And it was quite interesting, because against all odds, these two University of Utah students got a bill passed by the Senate and the House, even though we were told it couldn't. The Board of Regents at the time was against it. Everybody was against it, and got the bill passed and signed into law. And I'm proud to say, I know I'm proud to say, that I'm the only Utah registered lobbyist who's had a bill signed by Cal Rampton. So I've had 7 governors who I've worked with, and feel very, very good about that. From the University of Utah, I went to Salt Lake City and represented Salt Lake. Worked in city government for 10 years. Part of my responsibility was lobbying the legislature. In 1985, I went from Salt Lake City to the Utah League of Cities and Towns. I was the lobbyist for all the cities in the state. That's a position that Lincoln now holds, and I was there from 1985 through 2002. And then in 2002, I left and have my own firm, and I'm what you would call a contract lobbyist. I have about a dozen to 15 clients. I represent them, and hopefully do what they want me to do, but also do what I think is good public policy. And I represent 3 or 4 cities, police chiefs, fire chiefs, a lot of public safety, a lot of telecommunications, and that's really my forte. But anyway, going from there, lobbying, and what's important, I think, to me to talk about at the onset is what lobbyists do, and sometimes we get a bad rap, and we know that, but lobbyists provide information. And when you sit back and think for a second, there are 104 legislators, 29 senators, 75 House members, 104 legislators who are part-time as a legislator. They meet 45 calendar days, beginning the 4th Monday in January. Weekends count as part of those 45 days, although they don't meet. And historically, when you consider that there are about 800 or 900 pieces of legislation that gets numbered, half of that many gets debated, and you're asking 104 part-time legislators in a 45-day period make decisions on issues that are very, very critical. Now, the more critical the issue, the more the less critical the issue, and the less to the issue, the little discussion. But when we're asking 104 legislators to make a decision on issues, it's important that lobbyists play an important role. And our role is passing on information. Our role is providing the details, providing the documentation, why voting one way or another on those pieces of legislation is important. Now, so our finished product is a piece of legislation that has to get 38 votes in the House, 15 votes in the Senate, and a governor's signature. Now, let me repeat that for a second, because there are 75 House members, 29 senators. In order for a bill to pass, it has to go through both chambers with the same language, and it has to receive a constitutional majority. And what that is the majority of 75 is 38, the majority of 29 is 15. If 10 people are absent one day, that doesn't mean your number that you need to pass goes down. You still need that constitutional majority of 38, 15, and 1. So it's much more difficult to pass a bill than it is to kill one. So, but the key is that we need to provide the data, the documentation, walk bills through the process to get to that point. Let me talk about 2 other things. Let me talk about the process, and then I'll talk about types of lobbying. A bill can get started any time. If you look at a calendar year from January through December, the legislature convenes in January. A lot of work happens from the 1st of January to the 4th Monday in January. That's when a lot of the bills gets numbered, they get printed, they get out, a lot of discussion happens. The legislature has appropriations committees even before the 4th Monday in January to start talking about the governor's budget. Session ends in March, and then 60 days at the conclusion of a legislative session, the bills become law, unless there's a special enactment clause in the legislation, which would be upon the governor's signature, or another specified date. If it's a tax bill, probably July 1st, because that's when the fiscal year starts. But the 60 days following legislative session is when the bills become law. The next day, bill files can be opened for the following year. So as early as the middle of May, bill files can be opened. And then so from that point on through the end of the calendar year, which is the period we're in right now, the legislature meets on the 3rd Wednesday of every month in what's called interim committees. People like me, lobbyists, are meeting with legislators to talk about what we think issues that we need for the next year's legislative session. Legislators get a hold of folks in their staff, and they have 3 staff offices: Legislative Research and General Counsel. They do the research and draft the bills. The Legislative Fiscal Analyst's Office, they determine what the cost of those bills are and how to put together the budget. And the Legislative Auditor's Office, they're able to audit various departments as to if they're doing a good job or not. So from that May to December period, we're talking to legislators about potential legislative issues. Simultaneously, the governor in August begins his budget preparation work. And in December, the governor presents his budget. In January, the legislature starts having hearings on his budget. Then the legislature begins on that 4th Monday in January. That's essentially the process in between the session. When the session begins, to pass legislation, as I said earlier, the bills need to go through both the House and the Senate. So if you start the bill in the Senate, you have a Senate hearing in a standing committee. And those committees can range anywhere from 5 to 10 or 11 senators. Bill gets approved, goes to the Senate floor. In the Senate, there are 2 readings, 2nd reading and 3rd reading. And 2nd reading is typically where most of the amendments get made. And then there's a vote up or down. And again, as I mentioned, you need 15 votes to pass in both the 2nd and the 3rd reading. Bill passes the Senate, goes over to the House, and it goes through the same process. The Rules Committee in each chamber is the gatekeeper, and the Rules Committee determines if a bill gets heard at all, and if it does get heard, what committee it goes to. So then in the House, it goes to a committee hearings. In the House committees, there are probably anywhere from about 9 to 17 people. And so there's the committee hearing in the House. If it passes there, it goes to the House floor, and then at that point in time, it's voted on. And as I mentioned earlier, you need 38 votes to pass in the House. If the bill gets amended in the House at any time, it has to go back to the Senate for concurrence or for rejection of concurrence, and then you could have a conference committee. But essentially, 15 votes in the Senate, 38 in the House, governor's signature. That's the process. As I mentioned earlier, and welcome, Lincoln. We'll let Lincoln get mic'd up. As I mentioned earlier, our role as lobbyists is to pass along information to legislators, is to work on what we consider as a good conclusion, not only for our clients, but also for good public policy. And historically, the methods of, practically the methods of lobbying stay the same. You talk to legislators, you give them information. Face-to-face is the most appropriate and the best method of communication. If you can't do that, then of course you do letters, you do, and I'll give you a historical perspective. When I started, it was either face-to-face, phone calls, or letters. That was it. There were no cell phones. And so at the Capitol on the 3rd floor, there was a bank of payphones, between the House and the Senate, that if you needed to get something from your client or get information out, you had to rush to the payphones.
Send the smoke signal.
Set up the smoke signals and do all those sorts of things. Lincoln's now telling how really old I really am. And then the next day, or you made friends with people in offices that you could go into an office and use a phone. And then, as I said, it was letters. There was no such thing as emails. There was no such things as texting. And now all the methods of communication have changed. Now, if you look at the boards in the House and the Senate, they're all electronic. Back years and years ago, when I started, the boards were chalkboards and chalk. And so things have progressed immensely in those 40 years. And so the best method of communication is face-to-face. There's a lot of texting, there's a lot of emails, there's a lot of communication. Our goal is to convince the legislators that our side is right. I'm going to conclude with one fact, I think, and that is, if you're in construction, you build buildings. If you're an architect, you draw buildings for those in construction to build. At the end of the day, you've got a finished product. Our finished product is the piece of legislation that is debated and voted upon and hopefully passed and signed by the governor. And because we don't have those, I'll call it bricks and mortar view as to what's good and what's right, what we have to provide is our credibility. And as lobbyists, if one legislator thinks that you have spoken to him or her and not told the truth, information was inadequate, information was inaccurate, that word travels like wildfire. And then if our credibility is gone, it doesn't matter what we say from that point on. It's like a contractor building a bad building that falls down. You're not going to hire that guy again. In our particular situation, if you say something that's not true, if you pass on information that is totally inaccurate, if you talk personally about a legislator and share stories that are embarrassing, then that pretty much can cause a dent in your credibility, and then your word is going to be questioned from that point on. I'll conclude. I'll introduce Lincoln. Lincoln is probably one of the younger, brighter lobbyists we have on the Hill. And I say that a little bit because for the first couple of years when I was still at the League of Cities, Lincoln was coming up through our ranks. And Lincoln does a very, very good job. And it's an honor for me to be sitting here next to him.
Thanks, Dave. What's the class?
Lobbying.
The base class is state and local government.
Okay.
And there are a number of students here from my large American national government sections as well.
Perfect. Great. So my name's Lincoln Shurtz, as Dave mentioned, and I've been working up on Capitol here. This will be my 14th session that I'm coming into this year. So started fairly young, actually worked for Dave Spatafore as kind of his intern and collected a bunch of information for him and helped him in his practice up on Capitol Hill for the first couple years. Then Dave left for greener pastures to go be a contract lobbyist out of house, and I'll kind of explain the differences between the different types of lobbyists as well. And I took over the operation for the League of Cities and Towns, heading up their government affairs effort, and have been doing that for about 11 years now. So that's a little bit of my background. I was a student of Tim's, was up here at the University of Utah, got my undergrad in economics and political science as well, so kind of the same basic things that many of you are probably working on now. Lobbying is, as Dave mentioned, it is really a credibility game, and you try and figure out, probably the biggest question we usually get when we do these classes is, how do you get into the business? And I don't know the answer to that question, honestly. It's the wrong place at the wrong time is probably how you get into the business. I got into it the good old-fashioned way. My family's involved in politics and has been in the Valley for quite some time, so it's kind of been in my blood, and that's how some of my early connections came about and the interest to at least be involved in the process. And then obviously working for Dave just kind of springboarded me into the lobbying world. So I'll give you a little background on the different types of lobbyists up there and a little bit how it's changed even over the 15 or so years that I've been associated with it. To me, there are really three basic types of lobbyists. There's the in-house lobbyists, which are the folks that are hired by institutions. So some of the institutions you can think of are the UEA, the Utah League of Cities and Towns, the Association of Counties,
The University of
Utah, Planned Parenthood, some of these groups that have kind of institutions that are just year in and year out dealing with issues before the legislature. And you may ask why these institutions exist, and for the most part it's because they're involved in highly regulated businesses. For the cities and towns, which is who I work for, our policies, our guiding principles, everything that we can do is set forth by the state legislature. So in the Constitution, they essentially said that the state must allow for political subdivisions of the state, and the powers given to those political subdivisions are granted by the legislature. So by its very nature, there's going to be a lot of interaction between cities and towns and those who give them or grant them the power, which is the state legislature. So they have an in-house team that works on government affairs efforts. In addition to in-house lobbyists, you have contract lobbyists, and that's similar to what Dave does. I do some contract work as well, and that's essentially you hang your shingle on the door and you're a man for hire. So any industry, any group, any individual can hire you to represent them before the government. Again, it's a constitutionally protected right that you can redress your government, and that's where lobbying began, is this notion to redress government. So from that standpoint, there are probably, you always hear the number that there's 1,000 registered lobbyists in the state of Utah, and that's true. But point of fact, there's probably, what would you say, maybe 24 that are kind of the traditional contract lobbyists. They probably do 85-90% of the work out of about two dozen folks that are contract lobbyists. And then you do have some hybrid lobbyists that kind of go between contract lobbying and in-house lobbying as well, and that's where I'd kind of put myself. I do some in-house work for the League of Cities and Towns, and then I do some contract lobbying on the side for various companies that have issues that I kind of specialize in. And what you're starting to see more and more in terms of lobbyists is folks are specializing in different areas of the law. You have a group of lobbyists that are highly skilled in transportation funding, and they specialize kind of primarily in transportation and infrastructure investment. You have folks that specialize uniquely in economic development, others that do stuff that's just oil and gas, and there's a group of lobbyists that kind of specialize in oil and gas issues. There's a whole group that deals with property rights issues and land development issues. So again, you kind of see these highly specialized folks that have a unique interest in a certain area or unique skill set, many of which are attorneys. There are a couple of us that aren't attorneys, but a lot of folks up there are attorneys that specialize in this certain area of law. And what they've kind of realized, and it's, in my opinion, a new trend, is that it's much cheaper to hire a lobbyist and go change the law than it is to go fight it in court. And so you have a lot of attorneys that have actually kind of morphed their practice into changing the law to be favorable to their clients' needs versus going up and arguing before a judge that their perspective's right on an existing piece of the law. So you're seeing that dynamic kind of shift a little bit, in my opinion, at least in Utah, where folks can wait a year, change the law, and then they have favorable circumstances for their clients or their interests.
That's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
A number of the legislators who are lawyers, would tell a client, you don't want to go to law, you don't want to take it to court. Just wait a year and we'll change the law next year.
Yeah.
And that's how that started.
So you're seeing that process change quite a bit. Just a little bit about, and as I walked in, I heard Dave talking a little bit about.
One of the kind of lobbyists, grassroots lobbyists.
That's true. Yeah.
Those people who go up and work for a cause, and may or may not get paid for it, but it's your Geld Ruzicka Eagle Forum, it's your PTA, it's your health policy advocates, your children's advocates. There are a number of folks like that.
Yeah, you have several mothers and fathers that go up and talk about parental rights issues, or several times. There's actually been a few legislators who had children with disabilities and went up and started actually lobbying on behalf of funding for disability and insurance coverage for different types of disabilities, and then kind of morph that into actually becoming legislators and lawmakers. So, Dave, I heard him talking a little bit about kind of the nature of the business and how it works and the time frames. Hopefully this can give you a little bit of perspective on just the speed in which the legislature works. The legislature's in session for 45 days. That's including weekends of which they don't work, so there's actually about 34 working days during the legislative session. It runs from January through about the middle of March, depending on how the calendar falls. In that time, there's about 1,000 pieces of filed legislation. So each legislator can file as many bills as they want. Some file as many as 15, 20 bills. Others don't file any. But on average, you'll see between 800 and 1,000 pieces of legislation introduced. Of those, probably, what would you say, Dave, 400 or 500 or so get debated and contemplated by the legislature. And again, keep in mind, this is in 33 days. 500 different pieces of legislation getting contemplated by both the House and the Senate, going to committees, going to the floor for debate. And then in addition to 500 policy changes that they want to make in the statute, they're also balancing a $13 billion budget and deciding where they're going to spend $13 billion over the next year. So the speed in which things are moving is very, very quick, which is another reason why I think lobbyists have taken a more important role in the legislative process, particularly in Utah. Just because if you're a casual watcher of the legislature, it will race right past you before you realize what's happened. And a lot of folks just hire us to watch their issues and make sure that it goes through the process. What you soon realize as well is most of the work is done before you get to the legislative session. We're working on legislation now for the upcoming session, and really what you're doing at that point is just putting the finishing touches on things and going through the process. For much of the significant issues, much of the debate has been done during the interim period, through the committee process, and working with legislators on a one-on-one basis on our issues, so that when we get there, there are no surprises. If you hit a roadblock and you only have 33 days to get past it, you got to be able to anticipate what those roadblocks are and kind of have the strategy put together as to how you're going to maneuver around those issues when you get up there, else you're going to be in a world of hurt in terms of trying to get things done. So it gives you a little bit of a flavor of the speed of the session. On a typical day, I'm usually tracking between 15 or 20 pieces of legislation that are going to committee, being debated on the floor. So they're long days and very, very busy as you run between different issues and trying to catch everyone on those issues as they're coming up on the calendar. Anything you
No.
wanna-
I think, turn it over to questions.
Okay, we'll devote the remainder of the time to questions. Please speak directly into the microphone when I bring it to you. State your name again, a little information about yourself, and then ask your question. Okay.
My name is Tyler Glauser. I'm a student in the business school here. I'm in the American National Government class. And I was, something that you had said, David, is that what I call you?
Absolutely.
He's been
it
called worse.
was very interesting to me. And I would just like to know, how is it that increased social media networks have changed or affected a little bit more what you do as lobbyists, and maybe even the way that the senators think when they're considering these issues in the legislation process?
Tyler, that's a good question, and I'll answer a little bit, but I'm gonna probably let Lincoln talk about social media, because tweeting. I actually had a Twitter handle. The 2012 election, I think it was. I helped Channel 4 a little bit because I used to have a contract with Channel 4 doing all their political polling and their election night forecasting. So they had me do tweeting on the 2012 elections, but ever since then, tweeting and Facebook. If you saw Rod Decker the other night, he was interviewed. He doesn't tweet, he doesn't email, he doesn't do any of that stuff. I'm not quite as bad and arcane as Rod, but I'm pretty close. So I'll let Lincoln handle the tweetering, with all that stuff. But anyway, in terms of how things have changed, today you will see in a committee hearing, and even on the House and Senate floor, legislators have their cell phones in front of them. They do. They have their laptop computers. 40 years ago at the legislature, all the legislation was paper. And so at the beginning of the legislative session, you would see the legislator in their desk, and there would be one binder on top of their desk. Then about the second week of the session, there would be two binders, one for House bills and one for Senate bills. Then you'd probably see three binders. And by the end of the session, you couldn't see the legislator because on top of their desk are all the binders of all the paperback of all the bills. Today it's all computerized. So they have their laptop, takes them with them, but they have their cell phone with them. And lobbyists, a lot of folks have the cell phone numbers of the legislators. And so there's a lot of emails that go on. There's a lot of texting that goes on, and the legislators want to get that information. So how does a legislator think about it? I don't want to go how a legislator thinks, because some do and some don't. but it's interesting that the legislators really are encouraged by getting all that information. Let me give you a very, very recent example. NCSL, National Conference of State Legislators, met in Atlanta about 3 weeks ago. There was an issue that I was supposed to present on with Senator Kurt Bramble and Senator Karen Maine. And when I got there, the folks who were on the other side of the issue saw me and they said, if Spatafore is speaking, we're not going to speak. Which is fine. My reputation preceded me, and I think my reputation was enhanced because of that. So what happened is Senator Bramble said, all right, Dave, whatever you need to have presented, just text it to me. And so during that 45 minutes, I was texting Kurt, and Kurt was responding to it. So that's one of the ways and how technology has changed. Social media, though, Lincoln, I can barely spell it, let alone do it.
On a couple things on social media. One way in which I think it's changed is just the evolution of the news cycle. What you're seeing now is, even when I first started, I'd wait for the morning paper, and I took both papers, and every morning I'd get up and I'd read the paper to see what was in the news, what was being covered, how was it being portrayed. And now, especially with social media, Twitter and Facebook and the others, you have reporters. The political reporter that's probably the most pronounced on this is Robert Gerke, but he's putting out stories every 10, 15 minutes. He's, depending on what story he's working on, he'll put out little nuggets of information that can kind of give you an idea of where things are going before the traditional news cycle kind of picks up on it. So from the standpoint of following these issues, certainly following what other people are doing, and I primarily just follow the news sources to figure out kind of what's going on and where things are moving. and what's being said about certain things. But it's certainly changed in that I can't just wait to read the paper in the morning. It's kind of a constant, as my girlfriend says, are you ever not reading the newspaper? Because I'm constantly checking the Salt Lake Tribune or the Deseret News to figure out what's been updated and what's coming up. And I think what you're seeing right now, for those of you who are interested in the news and the news media, the struggle that KSL is having right now, who's been kind of historically always the top of the ranks, at least in this area, for their news coverage, and they're still trying to figure their way out and figure out how they're going to morph with the changes in the news cycle. So that's one way it's changed. The other issue, and it's something to keep in mind, legislatures by their very nature have an ego. I mean, if you're going to go into your neighborhood and put your name and face all over signs and materials and go tell all your friends and neighbors to vote for you, inherently there's an ego associated with that. And many of them like to stroke their ego on Facebook and Twitter and the like. And so keeping up on what legislators are saying on various issues is also an important way to just get a better perspective of how they're going to approach things. You have some very prolific bloggers and Facebookers and Twitter people, I guess. I don't know what you'd call them. Tweeters out there that are doing a lot of stuff. Steve Urquhart in particular has put Steve Urquhart chairs the Appropriations Committee for Higher Education, very heavily involved in domestic partnership and gender equality issues as well. If you read his blogs and what he's putting on Facebook, you can get a pretty good idea of where he's coming down on these issues without even sitting down and talking to him. And so when you're doing either client research, working with your clients to figure out who your allies are going to be or which direction you're going to take an issue, giving them access to that and letting them know where they can find some of that information is somewhat helpful. And it's just, with everything, more information means more opportunity to better inform both your clients and yourself and figure out which strategy you're going to use on your issues.
Hi, my name is Satine. I'm a political science major and I'm pre-med. And just for your information, in case you're wondering, people who tweet are called tweeps for future reference.
Perfect.
My question is, just out of curiosity, out of all the lobbyists, what industry or special interest groups are what is the majority, what are the majority, of all
Which
lobbyists?
industry
Yes.
spends the most money on lobbying? Is that kind of the...
Yeah, who's the most represented on the Capitol?
Nationally, I can give you firm data nationally. It would be a little bit of speculation on the local level, but I think it would probably follow the same trend line. Nationally, first and foremost is pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies spend the most money on lobbying of any other industry in the national perspective. Next to that is tobacco. And then next to that is the alcohol industry. And then next to that is government. So that gives you an idea of where regulation is occurring. At the local level, you have an immense influence from land developers. There's several lobbyists that specialize particularly in land development. The Utah Realtors Association is probably one of the strongest political action committees in terms of their resources and capital that they have to throw towards issues. But just on sheer issues, obviously with the Affordable Care Act, healthcare is probably the largest booming industry right now in terms of lobbyists. And it's not just on the pharmaceutical side, but you have the hospitals, as well as the doctors, as well as the pharmaceuticals, as well as all kind of the nursing and nurse practitioners. You get just a whole host of groups that are anxious about what the future tells for them in terms of healthcare. And with the Affordable Care Act coming in that regulates heavily all of those activities, you're seeing an immense amount of growth in those sorts of industries as well here locally.
I think Lincoln hit them all, but I'm going to add one more, and that's financial institutions, banking and credit unions. I think they spend a lot of money.
My name is Brett, and I'm a double major in political science and business. My question is, you said lobbying is a game of credibility. How does one build credibility? How is it perceived and measured? And then if you do lose all credibility, how does one obtain more credible background to continue the lobbying career?
How is credibility measured? I think credibility can be measured or quantified by a number of ways. First of all, how successful you are in getting your clients' work passed, or nothing bad happening to your clients. So if you can show a pretty good track record of success, that pretty much quantifies your credibility. Another method to quantify credibility is the duration your tenure as a lobbyist and what kind of clients you have. If you're an institutional lobbyist and you represent a company or an association and you're there for a long time, that tenure, speaks to the quantification of your credibility. If you're a contract lobbyist, then I think the quantification of your credibility is the clients that you have. Are you able to keep your clients? Are you able to feed your family based on what you're earning? Those sorts of things. And to that regard, I'm going to say this about, just personally about me. I feel very, very comfortable in the fact that the client base I have today, I've pretty much had for the last 5 years. The one client I don't have is because it was a one-issue Southeastern Association of Governments, and Lincoln remembers this issue was a sales tax issue. They hired me for one session, we got a bill passed, and that was it. Other than that, I think I'd have to go back and say the clients I've had for the last 5 years I have today, and probably for the most part the clients I've had for the last 10 years I have today. So I think that would speak to the quantification of credibility. They're happy with what I've produced, that's there. The second part of your question, then I'll let Lincoln take a shot at both. The second part of your question is really an interesting one, and that is, once your credibility is damaged, how do you get it back? That's a very, very good question, because there have been some folks who've had damaged credibility and they're not there anymore, both as a legislator and as lobbyists. Depending on how huge or how integral that gap in credibility was, I think determines on if you're able to salvage yourself. And I'm trying to think. Legislatively, Mel Brown got in trouble when he was Speaker over talking to lobbyists in a restaurant. He moved from Midvale to Colville, got remarried, rebuilt his credibility, now he's back in the legislature. I don't know if there was an ethical issue with Mel at that point in time, but he was able to rebuild and come back.
Two things. He changed his district, so he didn't represent the same group of
That's
folks.
right.
He moved from Midvale to Colville.
To Colville.
And a fair amount of time transpired before he came back.
I think, people in Utah tend to be a forgiving sort. However, if your lack of credibility causes embarrassment or causes a lot of problems, then I'm not sure you can get back into this business.
No, and I think Dave hit it on the head. The interesting thing is credibility is actually running both ways as well. You have to have credibility with your clients or else they won't retain you, and you have to have credibility with the legislature so you can effectively represent your clients. And it's two very different audiences, and I think sometimes folks in our business confuse likability with credibility. You have to appreciate we're in a business where we tend to make the other side mad. When you're pushing something, in most circumstances, there's someone on the other side that you're working against. It makes it highly competitive and somewhat catty at times, and you can't confuse likability with credibility. Some of the most kind of dogged fighters up there are the ones that have the most credibility and have the best client lists. So that's something to keep in mind, that it's not about being liked per se, it's about being effective and being honest. And once you're not honest, I don't know if you can rebuild that. Time's about the only thing, I guess, and kind of changing your behavioral patterns. The interesting thing you got to remember, though, is the business is always evolving in the sense that this year at the legislature, there were a majority of the House that had less than 2 years of service. So if you put that you're getting a fair amount of churn in the House of Representatives, where folks that were there yesterday aren't here today, and you're always getting new people coming into the system that you're working with and have the opportunity to rebuild that credibility, I guess.
Hi, my name's Andrea, and I'm in Dr. Chambliss' American National Government class, just basic political science. I kind of have a two-part question. How does one propose an effective bill that could be lobbied for or against? Let's bring it stateside, keep it specific to Utah. And I did have another question that had to do with what you were talking about concerning, well, both of you were talking about legal action and how a lot of lobbyists are steering or kind of veering away from trying to make change using legal action. How is it that, say county filings, stateside, who determines how much tax dollars or what amount of our tax-paying dollars go towards that? How does one have a say in those kinds of issues? Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. You want me to go first? In terms of how do you propose legislation, by state law, state legislator is the only one who can introduce legislation. So the first thing I traditionally do when I have a client or there's an issue that they're, and I'm just going to use a real world example because I think it's the easiest way to illustrate. I had a client last year who was looking to get some transportation funding for an economic development project that he was working on in West Valley City. So they approached me and said, hey, this is what we're doing. This is the scope of our project. Can you help us talk to the legislature and impress upon them the importance of this project and hopefully get us some money appropriated for the project? So when that client called, I immediately started doing research on which lawmakers are most apt in transportation funding, those who had background in those sorts of issues. Then very early on set up a meeting with that legislator and my client to go over the scope of the project and get kind of a gut check as to whether or not he thought there was a legitimate chance of getting additional money there. Go ahead.
So can you, I mean, say that you go to a website, like, I don't know, some sort of lobbying website where you start some sort of loose petition and you receive signatures and then
Sure.
you get funding. Can you do it that way outside of that box?
Outside of the traditional
like
process.
MoveOn.org, for example, or just one of those, there's almost like grassroots lobbying,
Utah
like you were
has,
saying.
Utah has in the statute, legislation by petition. And right now, if I'm not mistaken, and it's been a while since I've looked at it, I think if petitioners get 10% of the registered voters who voted for governor the previous election in 26 of the 29 Senate districts, that automatically goes to the ballot. Historically, if 5% was achieved, and I don't know if this is still the case, and so I'd want to look this up, or maybe Professor Chambliss can look it up and follow up with it. If 5% was achieved, the proponents of that petition can ask the legislature to consider it at the next legislative session, and it has to be considered. So, but my caveat to that is the initiative petitions in Utah have been changed significantly. You know, years and years ago, it was 10% total. Then it went 10% and you had to get that number in 15 of the 29 counties. Then it was changed to 26 of the 29 Senate districts. And I don't know if in any of those iterations that 5% legislation by initiative is still there, has been taken out. But that's a great question.
Well, and the follow-up to that is on the local government level, it was also just challenged in court it was about 18 months ago, as to whether or not you could refer any action, including the budget of a municipality, to the ballot. And the Supreme Court came back and said, not only can you do any piece of legislative action, but you can also refer the budget. So we've seen this year alone, I think there were 5 cities who had their budget referred to the ballot because they were proposing a property tax increase. So you had Highland, Orem, Pleasant Grove, and I think Layton had one on a land use issue where actually the citizens gathered the signatures, and for a municipal election, it's 10% of those who voted and less for governor in the last election. But at a city level, it's much easier to do. For Highland, I think they had to gather all of 600 signatures to put it on the ballot as to whether or not they were going to have the property tax increase. So that gives you a flavor of.
See, you know, Lincoln talks about this.
Escalante or Torrey type of cities, is
You
that, okay.
Same thing, same process. In Torrey, you'd probably have to get all of about 6 signatures, and it'd go on the ballot.
You know, Lincoln mentioned those cities in Utah County. You know, if they had a better football team in Utah County, they wouldn't have to worry about getting signatures.
That is true.
Hey, we got to gear up. It's the 24th of September, guys. You know, you got to get ready for the Utah BYU game. We'll be 3-0, and they'll be 0-2. Watch it.
Kevin Wall, you guys mentioned your credibility is based on your ability to pass along information, accurate information. Obviously, you guys are trying to persuade. So how do you judge if there's information you don't want to pass along, or if there's information that could damage your ability to get legislation passed, and then does that affect your credibility?
Any relation to former Mayor Russ Wall?
Yeah.
I thought so.
Unless that's a bad thing, then no.
No, it's a great thing. Your dad's a good friend to all of us. Kevin's dad was the mayor of Taylorsville for about 6 years, 7 years maybe.
Yeah,
City council before that, and now he works for Salt Lake County Mayor Ben McAdams. And Russ is one of the good guys in government, and he's a good friend, and he's just one of the good guys. To answer your question, a good lobbyist is going to know all the issues, all the facts about his or her client, to make sure that we pass along that information. A very good lobbyist is also going to know the issues against them. And I'll guarantee you, Kevin, if you're a good lobbyist, you're going to know that the legislators are going to hear the issues on the other side of the issue. You know, so holding things, you might want to hold some information back, not because it's embarrassing, but because that's additional information you could provide, you know, if and when you need it. But a good lobbyist is going to talk to legislators and say, this is a good bill, you ought to do it for these 3 or 4 reasons. And oh, by the way, you're going to hear that it's not a good idea because of this. You know, but that, you know, that's easily just, you know, thrown away because of these other 2 reasons. What I'm saying is a good lobbyist is really going to know what the other side's going to say. And withholding information because it's embarrassing is the worst thing you can do. Because believe you me, it'll get out.
It's not as much withholding as it is providing context. I mean, I think that's just like any good attorney, or whenever you're trying to be persuasive, know what the defense is going to say and provide context to it so that you can shape it and hopefully persuade them in the direction that you want them to go.
I set Kevin up because I met him a few years ago at a golf tournament.
I'm John Benyon. I'm an alumnus. There's a lot of concern about the corrosive effect of too much money in politics and giving to campaigns, and even perhaps hiring very high-priced lobbyists that can be more effective than other people can afford. To what extent do you think that the amount of money that gets poured in to the process is interfering with good judgments in terms of public policy and the process of really hearing arguments on their merits and so on?
First, let me say, I thought that was you, Mr. Benyon. How long ago were you the superintendent of Salt Lake City Schools?
Oh, it was 1994 when I came up here.
And yeah, so that tells you how experienced I am. When I'm going to talk about you and I'm not going to talk old. I'm going to talk experience, because my kids went through the Salt Lake City school districts when you were the superintendent, and I'll tell you, and when you talk about credibility and you talk about esteem, when Mr. Benyon went to the Capitol, legislators listened, and I'm glad to see you still around, because you had a tremendous legacy in the Salt Lake City school districts. I've often said I'd go back 20 years in a heartbeat at the legislature. You know, I wouldn't make as much money as I did 20 years. I didn't make as much money 20 years ago as I do today. But I think there was a lot more honor among our group and among legislators than there is today. And I think a lot of that is because of the money. You know, the state budget dwarfs what it was 20 years ago, you know, in terms of everything that's needed for public ed and higher ed. Lobbyists make a lot more money today than we made 20 years ago. And to some extent, money has changed the entire demeanor of the process. Battles seem to be a little bit more personal. Battles seem to be a little bit more important. But at the end of the day, John, I'm going to say this. At the end of the day, I think the right thing still happens, because the legislators do what's right for the state of Utah, regardless of what they're being told by lobbyists to make a lot of money. And I still think there's still that much credibility among the members of the legislature.
Money obviously has an influence. There's a reason people give money. They wouldn't be giving it if it didn't have an impact or an effect. So I don't think we can put on the rose-colored glasses and say it doesn't have any impact. But I think Dave's right. There have been several candidates, several lawmakers that my clients have given money to that don't vote the way I want, and that's okay. I think certainly the money, to a certain extent, is a piece dealing with access. There's certainly that piece of it. Obviously, elections cost a lot of money to run these days. I can even go back when I first started at a House seat. They were raising $15,000, $20,000 in the Salt Lake Valley for a House seat. Now you have candidates raising $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 to run for a House seat, which is just crazy.
Only if those are contested House races where the Democrat has a chance to win.
Exactly.
Or the Republican has a chance to win. Because right now there are so many districts that are really...
Yeah. But that gives you a flavor. The cost of retail politics has gotten considerably more expensive, and certainly money has an impact there. I'm like Dave. I'm not sure to what level it's become too corrosive. But there are times in which you certainly see it, and you can see certain industries dumping a lot more money in, and I don't know if you can say that the results can lead to that conclusion or not, but there's some of that can be pointed out for sure.
On behalf of the Hinckley Institute of Politics, we'd like to thank Lincoln Shurtz and David Spatafore for joining us and giving us an excellent and informative Hinckley Forum.
Thanks.